Chapter 27, The Respite, Antony's POV. Antony spent the next hour with Miss Alina and her attendant, Michio. Michio was pleasant and soft-spoken, and seemed to adore his tempestuous master. After half an hour or so, she sent him to check in on Felix and Thaddeus and make sure they didn't mind waiting a little longer for Antony to join them. Once the door shut behind him, Antony looked at his archer. "So, you're not quite out of lovers?" he ventured. Miss Alina snorted. "Ah, yes, there's still the man who offers his services in exchange for me acting as his bodyguard. That doesn't exactly make me feel more desirable, idiot." "All right, I deserved that." After Miss Alina finally banished Antony so she could get some sleep, he made his way to Felix's room. His head was still reeling with Miss Alina's words. Lose your soul, no souls, wore them away. Could it be true? Was each of them a soulless monster? Not that he'd ever thought a lot about souls in the flowery priestly sense, but he didn't think that was how Lena had meant it. Conscience, ethics, unselfishness, were those the things she meant to say they had lost? Perhaps. He might not remember every detail of his life before the curse, but he knew he wouldn't have slaughtered humans and liked it. Hell, none of them would. But would it be any better if they had gone on moping and crying about it the way they had done in the beginning? They would still need blood to live, and they would still need to offer the Taishans protection in exchange for that blood, and all the raiders would still be just as dead. It wouldn't make any difference if the vampires buried their drained bodies and planted roses on the graves and watered them all with their tears. Look at Felix, punishing himself for drinking from the elves. What did it accomplish? He still drank. The elves still languished. Still, Miss Alina's words and her bleak tone and her back laid out obediently and covered in cuts from his whip all naggled like a headache. Antony wished he didn't have any further obligations and could just go back to his rooms and flop onto his bed. Hell, the sun was probably up already. He was tense at the idea of Edgy opening the door when he knocked, but it was Felix who appeared. "Took you long enough," he said, but his smile seemed genuine. "You're kind and calming like Thad," Antony said with a shrug. "I'm an asshole like Lena. It seemed right to divide and conquer." "You're not an asshole," Thaddeus said loyally from within the room. He was sitting on one of the large, soft chairs that Felix kept by his massive bookshelf. He looked a bit haggard, but he wasn't sobbing or raging. Antony relaxed a little more. He crossed to the sitting area. There were only 2 soft chairs, and he wished that he could drag over one of the hard little stools that rested by the table. Unfortunately, they were bolted down as firmly as everything else. Instead, he sat gingerly on the carpet, wincing as his broken rib protested the movement. Both Felix and Thaddeus looked a little alarmed at that, and Thad half rose from his own chair. "Lord Antony, please," he started. "Oh, sit down." Antony waved his hand. "It's what I get for being late to the party. Anyhow, Hani's overtaken my washroom and my bed. I'm getting used to being politely displaced." He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. This was not the time to joke about his happy relationship with his attendant. Thaddeus's face darkened a little. "Shit," Antony growled. "See, I'm an asshole. I'm sorry, Thad." "It's all right." He didn't look like it actually was. "How's Lena?" "She's all right. You know how tough she is. Don't tear yourself up worrying for her." "Didn't seem tough today." Thaddeus gave a low laugh that was as close to bitter as anything Antony had ever heard from him. "Not that I'm terribly observant, obviously." "You didn't see something that people were taking pains to hide from you," Antony replied. "That's hardly a reason for shame." "I'm not upset that I missed the affair," Thaddeus ground out. Felix finally alighted in the chair opposite him, sparing an uneasy glance for Antony where he sprawled on the carpet. "He hid his dissatisfaction just as carefully," Felix told Thaddeus. "Try not to blame him too much, Thad. They're raised from babies not to complain to us or talk about their needs." Thaddeus nodded and looked even more miserable. "You're not—" Antony wasn't sure how to keep from phrasing this as an order. Ultimately, it wasn't his decision to make. "You won't do anything final?" "Final?" Thaddeus blinked, then his eyes bulged with understanding. "Wait, you thought I might kill him? Gods, Antony!" Felix started laughing. It was so incongruous that both of them whipped their heads around to glare at him. "I'm sorry," he choked, "but gods! Really, Thad?" Antony barked out a laugh as well, and after a moment, so did Thaddeus. "Oh dear," he sputtered. "I must have picked it up from Dido. Well, that will be awkward if I say it where he can hear." Antony felt a great swell of love for these two quiet, steady men. It was a gift to know them, to sprawl on the floor between them and laugh with them. He should be more like them. Why wasn't he more like them? Why on earth is Marcus my second? The thought flashed, quick and disloyal, before Antony pushed it back. Someone on this ship needed to be harsh and authoritarian, and he'd never been as good as that as he pretended. He needed someone to push him into that role. There weren't many in his little band who could do that. When he and his siblings had parted ways and their followers had all chosen where to bestow their allegiance, most of the tough-minded people had chosen his brother or sister. Antony had always been the soft one, and he'd attracted the soft-hearted to his service. This was proven when Thaddeus finally stopped laughing and grew serious once more. "I was never going to hurt him, Antony," he said quietly, "much less kill him. If he'd told me he wanted Lena, I'd have helped any way I could. I'm just hurt that he didn't talk to me about it. I had thought, after 12 years, I thought he trusted me at least a little, and of course having it come out the way it did was humiliating." "You shouldn't feel humiliated." Felix's voice was fierce. "You offered in front of everyone to take a lashing to give Dido a choice about his life. You're an example for all of us." "You both are." Antony was getting dangerously sentimental. It reminded him of the way he used to be when he was drunk, hugging everyone and sobbing helpless tears of love into their shoulders. But he couldn't help it when they were so fucking kind. He felt as if now that Miss Alina had brought up the idea of souls and kindness, he was seeing them everywhere except in himself. He wasn't as bad as Marcus or plenty of the others, especially when one took his siblings' crews into consideration, but he didn't think that was enough to qualify him as kind. Theodora was kind, in her fearsome defense of Kenta, and her gentleness with old Chihiro, and the way she valued and respected each of her offerings. Hell, in the way she'd taken care of Antony himself through his dark times. Felix was unrelentingly kind to every damn human on the ship. Thaddeus was kind in such a quiet, self-effacing way that it was easy to overlook. Others, too, maybe not the way they had once been, but... "I should go back to our rooms," Thaddeus said, looking as frightened as if he was suggesting walking into the jaws of a sea serpent. "He'll have worked himself into a fright by now, and I've hidden long enough." Miss Alina might have been right about herself, and Antony too, but looking at Thaddeus's bland, nervous face, Antony was sure that they had no one to blame but themselves. Some of the others still had their souls. Hanyu's POV. Hanyu found it hard to settle into a deep sleep without Antony there. He'd grown used to the god's presence, he supposed, whether in the bed above him or rattling about in the sitting room. The place felt quiet and lonely without him, and Hanyu could only doze fitfully. He woke immediately when the door opened, even though Antony was clearly taking pains to be quiet. "You're back!" Hanyu kicked free of his blanket and scrambled to greet his master. He liked feeling free to grin up at him before ducking into his bow. "I'm sorry I woke you," Lord Antony said. He sounded tired, and though Hanyu didn't have permission to do it, he straightened to his knees and peered up at the god. "You didn't really wake me, my lord," Hanyu said. "Anyhow, I'm glad to see you. I missed you." Antony sighed. "You're probably the only one who's been glad to see me all night." The god crossed to the sofa and flopped down on it. Hanyu hesitated, but then crawled over and sprawled at his feet, leaning back against his knees the way he did when Antony arranged his hair. His heart was pounding hard at his own daring, but his desire to chase the physical contact was too powerful to resist. Lord Antony didn't seem bothered by his presumption. He just kept talking. "I'm sure you heard what Julia said about the fight." "Yes, I did." Hanyu felt himself flush. "I'm sorry for eavesdropping." "It's not eavesdropping if we discuss it in front of you." Hanyu's hand settled absently on Hanyu's head and began gently stroking his hair. Hanyu worked hard to hold himself still so the god wouldn't notice what he was doing and stop. "Well, so you know Thaddeus and Miss Alina fought." Hanyu knew a fair bit about Lord Miss Alina. She was supposed to be a warrior god, quick and lovely and lethal as a lightning bolt. As for Lord Thaddeus, well, he knew the name anyway. Had he designed the city's aqueducts, or had that been a different god? Hanyu felt as if he had something to do with water or fish. He wished he'd paid better attention in his classes. "It turns out that Miss Alina had been sleeping with Thad's attendant behind his back, so I had to whip her," Antony went on. "Oh!" The thought drew Hanyu up short. He supposed he'd assumed after the events of yesterday that Lord Antony, never gave punishments? Was incapable? Too kind? Too soft? That was a ridiculous thing to think. The god had been kind to him, yes, but Hanyu had centuries of hymns and stories, and his own memory of bloody fingernails to show just how fearsome he could be. "You're frightened." It was a statement, not a question. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "I'm not frightened exactly, my lord. I'm just, well, it makes me even more grateful for your mercy yesterday." Antony snorted. "Well, you didn't jump on me and try to punch my organs into a pancake." Hanyu jerked his head around to gawk up at him. "What?" "Lena didn't take well to, well, anything," Antony said. "She decided to deal with her frustration by attacking me. Rather unfair, in my opinion." "Shit, Antony!" Hanyu was remembering every story he'd heard of Lord Messalina's ferocity. He started looking the god over for signs of injury. "Are you all right?" "Oh, don't fuss." Antony scowled and waved a hand, but Hanyu thought he sounded the tiniest bit pleased to be worried over. "She broke one of my ribs, but it's mostly better now. I pinned her before she could get in too many blows." "A broken rib?" Hanyu yelped. "I'm fine, Hanyu," the god assured him. "Really, we made up afterwards. She just had a really terrible day." "Why do all the gods deal with their bad days by hitting you?" Hanyu groused. Lord Antony burst out laughing, even more broken and wheezing than usual. "Oh no," he gasped. "You're right. Oh dear, it hurts to laugh." "Sorry." Hanyu wasn't sure whether he was more repentant or indignant. Much as he loved to hear his master's laughter, he didn't find the situation terribly funny. "But, Antony, I really think you should get them a punching dummy." "But then why would they keep me around?" Antony wheezed. "Anyhow, don't sell me short. I make a perfectly good punching dummy. At least take a swing at me yourself before you start trying to replace me." Then he was laughing again in great pained gasps. Hanyu could see that he wouldn't have much success getting his master to take the subject seriously, so he sighed and swiveled on his ass so he was resting his hands on the god's knees and looking up at him. "I don't want to hit you," he said. "I think there's been enough of that. Is there anything I could do to help you relax instead?" Lord Antony sobered at once. His eyes flicked down to Hanyu's, sharp and annoyed. Hanyu realized how his question had sounded, especially given his current position, and flushed. "Oh, I only meant... Think, Hanyu. I could read to you?" "I see." The god's gaze softened. "That sounds wonderful, actually. But are you sure you don't need to get some sleep?" "I just got up," Hanyu pointed out. "It's only been a few hours. I went to bed out of boredom." "Right." Antony sounded a little dazed. "It has only been a few hours, hasn't it? Damn. Well then, choose any book you like, and put on some clothes, will you?" Hanyu had forgotten he was naked. No wonder his master had thought he was trying to seduce him. Not that that sounded like a bad way to relax Antony either. Fighting down the thought, Hanyu got to his feet and padded into the bedroom. He deliberated for a while before choosing a book, then wound his blanket around himself and returned to the sitting room. Lord Antony was sprawled inelegantly over the sofa. He'd removed his boots and unbuttoned his top so that it gaped open over his undershirt. He looked wonderfully relaxed. At the sound of Hanyu's footsteps, he lulled his head back and cracked one silver eye open. "That's clothes?" he asked. Hanyu shrugged. "Sure, it's not that different from a robe, is it?" Antony groaned, but he sat up and patted the cushion next to him, so Hanyu figured he'd come close enough to obeying. He sat where the god indicated, then stiffened in shock when Lord Antony leaned back into his sprawl and settled his head on Hanyu's thigh. "Go ahead," he said, seemingly unaware of Hanyu's sudden petrification. Hanyu opened the book and tried his best, but his eyes couldn't quite focus on the words in front of his face. He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a formless croak. The god peered up at Hanyu. "Are you all right?" If Hanyu didn't pull himself together, he would lose his chance. "Dry throat," he lied, coughing a few times to make his point. To his dismay, Antony insisted on getting up and bringing him water, but once his master was satisfied that Hanyu had drunk enough, he settled back into the same spot. Now that Hanyu was anticipating the move, he was better able to deal with it. He started reading with only the slightest bit of tension in his voice. "Hands so small to hold the whole of me." Antony hummed approvingly. "The poems of Messiah? Good choice." "Really?" Hanyu looked away from the page. "I thought you'd be fussing at me because they're love poems." "Why would I have a book I didn't like? I don't keep things I don't want." Pleasure welled in Hanyu's belly, though he didn't think the words had been meant as a compliment for him. "Anyhow, Messiah's poems aren't just romantic, they're wickedly funny," Antony went on. "Funny?" Hanyu felt almost scandalized at the notion. He'd never heard anyone use that word in connection with the ancient master poet. Oh, yes, in her own sly manner. Antony smiled distantly. She was a nightmare at state affairs. She had a way of insulting you in such a way that it took you a day or two to realize what had happened. You knew Messiah? Hanyu goggled down at his master. You knew Messiah? Not as well as I would have liked, but yes. That was back when we used to do a good bit more circulating at your king's court during our visits than we do now. He's not my king anymore. Hanyu barely managed to bite back the words. At least until he was replaced, he didn't even want the implication that he might belong to anyone but Antony. The day would come soon enough on its own. She might not have been a particularly high-ranking noblewoman, but she had enough standing that our paths crossed, the god continued. Well, her path crossed with Theodora. Some of her first poems were for Theo, as it happens. Hanyu could picture Lord Theodore inspiring many kinds of poetry. Hero tales, war ballads, hymns by the dozen. But love poems? Love poems from the great Messiah? Goodness, Messiah was just a baby that first time, maybe 15? But she was still bold enough to confess her feelings and hand over the poems. Theo was gentle about letting her down and praised her poems. She only said it to be kind at the time. The poems were absolute shit. But when she came back 6 years later, she was still at it, showering poetry on her new lady love. Another 6 years, and the poems were actually getting good. By the time she was 70, she was writing masterpieces. She even settled a bet between me and Iovita. What kind of bet? It's embarrassing to say. Antony laughed and put a hand over his face, but went on. I used to be a terrible snob about the Taishan language. I thought it was too blunt and clumsy to produce great literature. Iovita has a passion for words and languages, and they said that I was full of shit. They bet that a Taishan writer would prove me wrong one day, and I was fool enough to take them up on it. Why was it foolish? Hanyu asked. In the first place, because when I finally bothered to put some effort into understanding Taishan, I found dozens of undeniable masterpieces from even before we arrived. In the second place, because bets with Iovita are always foolish. They like to bet very embarrassing public spectacles. This particular instance involved a bucket of oil and an enormous fish, and that's all you're ever going to know about it. Hanyu fully intended to be insufferable until he got the whole story. He set the book aside and got ready to wheedle. What are you doing? Antony demanded. Don't you want to read any more? Well, you heard Messiah herself reading her poems. It would be too embarrassing for me to try. You'd laugh at the comparison. It wasn't just the words he was suddenly shy of. It was his listener. Hanyu felt as if this was the first time he'd really understood how old the god was. He'd known that Antony was immortal, of course, but it had never really sunk into his mind that he had been active that entire time. After so many centuries of doing things and meeting people, why in the world did he want to spend time with Hanyu? Hanyu had never done anything. He must seem so dull and insignificant compared to all the poets and kings and heroes and gods that Antony had known. Why did his master bother with him at all? I would not laugh at you. Antony raised an eyebrow at him, breaking him out of his awestruck thoughts. She might have been a great poet, but Messiah was a shit reader. She used to get embarrassed and mumble her way through all the flowerier scandalous bits, even when she was far too old for such coyness. That was even harder to imagine than Messiah as a sly courtier or a love-struck teenager clutching a sheath of bad poetry. Her poems were a pleasure to read aloud. Meters and alliterations flowed so gorgeously that it was like a verbal dance. How could the poet herself fail to appreciate that joy? Come now, Hanyu. Why was his master coaxing rather than commanding? I've been looking forward to hearing you read. Of course, if that's your wish. Hanyu retrieved the book. He still felt a little shy, but as the god had said himself, he didn't keep things he didn't like. Antony settled back against his thigh, eyes closed and mouth curving into a faint, contented smile. Hanyu felt his heart warming at the sight and had to work to turn his eyes onto the page. Hands so small to hold the whole of me.